Welcome back. We are back live at the INSS Lipkin-Shahak conference, and we are in the first panel. This panel is going to deal with disinformation and what we learned about disinformation in 2020. Who are the actors? What are the threats? And are there any relevant solutions? The Lipkin-Shahak program is dealing with national security and democracy in the era of post-truth and fake news. The term post-truth entered our discourse in 2016 after the Brexit, after the US election, when the Oxford Dictionary decided to choose post-truth as its word of the year, defining post-truth as a political culture in which beliefs, opinions, feelings, emotions are more influential than facts. At the same time, we started to use the term fake news, first as part of the political debate, Trump accusing CNN of disseminating fake news, and then also in the academic discourse to define to disseminate in large scale errors, mistakes, lies, spins, conspiracy theories. The US election in 2016 demonstrated to many that this situation is not only the natural outcome of technological, political, economic, social, and ideological processes, but also a result of a deliberate dissemination effort made by a wide range of actors. All this leads, of course, to increasing difficulty, to growing difficulty to clarify reality, to understand reality, and by that, this difficulty undermines the foundations of our democracy and our national security. So exactly 4 years later, we are here in this panel, and this panel is supposed to deal with what we learned since then, and especially in 2020. And no doubt that 2020 gave us at least 3 main learning opportunities. First and foremost, the US election, then prior to that, COVID-19, which according to the WHO, the World Health Organization, was accompanied by infodemic, spreading rumors and false information. And finally, also in the demonstrations, the social unrest that we see in different places around the world, including the United States, Israel, and Europe. So we'll start this discussion with Nina Jankowicz. Nina is a disinformation fellow for the independent research group at the Wilson Center in Washington, DC. Nina, good afternoon, our time. You recently published your book, How to Lose the Information War, Russia, Fake News, and the Future of Conflict. So what is the disinformation war? Who are the fighting sides of this war? And in your opinion, how did it affect the US election?
Thank you so much for having me this morning or this afternoon where you are. It's really a delight to be here on this panel with so many distinguished voices in this space. When I set out to write my book, How to Lose the Information War, I was really looking at Russian disinformation and Russian disinformation as targeted toward the West. But the main conclusion of the book is really not about Russian disinformation. It's about the fissures in our societies that are exploited not only by our foreign adversaries, Russia, China, Iran, but also by opportunistic individuals, often on the political spectrum, sometimes working for profit, here in our domestic information environments. And I think, although, of course, I would have preferred not to release my book during a pandemic, the last couple of months have really shown how important those conclusions are. The fact that we need to look inward if we're going to win the information war. There will always be opportunistic adversaries, foreign and domestic, who are trying to weaponize the fissures in our societies. Things like systemic racism, economic inequality, the urban-rural divide, pitting populations against one another. But if we build up our resilience internally, we'll have a much better time countering those adversaries. We can't just play whack-a-troll, deleting fake accounts, deleting harmful content. And we've seen that in this election, frankly. We've seen efforts by the social media companies to clamp down on information, to change very, in the short term, their content moderation policies, things like that. But ultimately, the most harmful disinformation during this past couple of months, I would say, especially ramping up over the summer since May or June, has come from inside the house. It's come from our own politicians, our own commentators and influencers. And that's the sort of thing that we're seeing the foreign adversaries echoing. They don't need to be as creative or use as much brute force this time around. All they really need to do is hit retweet on something that President Trump puts out there, right? And again, those most harmful narratives that we've seen this year are coming from domestic sources, the things that are inspiring online harms to turn into offline violence, whether that's, militias organizing to kidnap the governor of Michigan, or people going to counting centers as the results of the election are being certified to intimidate election and poll workers. We've seen death threats about this stuff. And so, it's really important to recognize these domestic harms that exist. And if we are going to address them, and I'm sure we'll get to this today, we can't really separate the foreign disinformation from the domestic stuff. They are holistic. They are two sides of the same coin. And so in my work, based on what I've seen in Central and Eastern Europe, countries that have been dealing with this threat, not only as a foreign policy and national security problem, but something domestically that's been going on for a long time as well, they have really invested in what I call citizens-based solutions. So yes, countries like Estonia have increased their cyber defenses, but they're also investing in their populations. They're investing in teaching media and digital literacy and civics. They're investing in education. A lot of what you just talked about in the opening interview deals with that, giving people the tools they need to navigate today's information environment, which is increasingly chaotic and may or may not have this concept of truth decay, really being pervasive at this point. So I think I want to leave it there to make sure that we have plenty of time for discussion and to hear from everyone else. But I would say the information war is no longer something that has this foreign domestic dichotomy. We are in this very globalized information environment. And in order to protect our national security, our democratic discourse, we need to think about the local environment, think about ourselves, and look a little bit inward as we try to deal with this problem. Thank you.
Thank you, Nina. Since you mentioned that it's coming from the outside and from the inside, I want to ask a short question. It's a little bit philosophical, but I think it's practical. So if it's coming from the outside and the inside, who are we? We're talking about we that should cope with it. Who are we?
Right. Well, okay. So here we are, a bunch of think tank folks. When I say we, I'm talking about policymakers, right? But this affects ordinary citizens as well. A democracy doesn't work without access to authoritative, trustworthy information. And we've seen that breaking down in this election cycle here in the United States. So if we want to have a really robust democracy in the future, if policymakers, if citizens want to invest in that, we need to demand from our elected officials that, this sort of behavior gets disincentivized, not normalized, as we've seen over the past 4 years. And we can do that at the ballot box. We can do that through legislation that increases transparency and oversight over some of the practices on social media platforms. And we can do it through campaign legislation. We don't have a lot of restrictions here in the United States about what candidates can and cannot say, and the types of rhetoric they can use, the types of things that they can pay to amplify on social media. And I think those are the hard conversations that we're going to start to have over the next couple of years.
Thank you very much, Nina. Yochai Benkler is a professor and co-director at the Berkman Klein Center for Internet and Society at Harvard Law School. Hi, Yochai. Well, probably you agree with Nina that at least some of the threat is coming from the inside. So how does this actually happen? And do you think that since you are putting the blame on at least some of the media, part of the media, do you think that what happened prior and after the elections with the social networks, with the television outlets, does this change anything?
So I know that you want to go to does this change anything, but you have to admit, I reject the entire 15 minutes you had with Rich. This parallelism. There's cognitive bias, there's social media, there's lack of trust. There is a specific dynamic. I'm sorry, back up. I'm now working from 5 years of observing, at this point, 8 million stories, tens of millions of tweets, working with a network of researchers who publish in Science and the Proceeding of National Academy of Sciences and Science Advances, on my own Oxford University Press published book. It's frustrating not to be able to get through. The United States is suffering an asymmetric polarization. It is coming from a specific market dynamic that has been in play since the 1980s, in which one part of the nation is operating in a propaganda feedback loop. The Russians are beside the point. They're a rounding error. They're not two sides of a coin. They're a rounding error. Fundamentally, what's driving it is Fox News, talk radio, associated around them with online media. Anyone who tries to explain disinformation, call it truth decay, call it whatever you want, information disorder in the United States, who doesn't start with the network on which the chair of the Senate Judiciary Committee can sit on the most popular television show and say Philadelphia is like an oily snake and they stole the election in Pennsylvania and everybody claps their hands, is just looking in the wrong place, is wasting all of our time. So and the reason that I'm speaking the way that I'm speaking is because I've been publishing this for years. You have pieces in Science showing you that fake news was very focused in over 65-year-old conservatives. And we hear all of this neutral thing. So is something important happening? Yes. Fox News in the last 10 days, from the election and on, has tried to actually counteract. The New York Post, which became a real complement to the disinformation and one of the major sources of mail-in ballot fraud disinformation that got circulated, also seems to be pulling back. So the Murdoch properties are pulling back, but the entire Republican leadership, from the Senate Majority Leader and the House Minority Leader, through the Senate Judiciary Chair, through the prospective 20, are telling the American people lies in order to undermine the legitimacy of the election. Who are we? We are people who care about democracy and want it to survive an attack by an ethno-nationalist, race-baiting party operating within a mass media propaganda loop and getting our time wasted talking about rounding errors like Russians on Twitter.
So in your opinion, if we will take this right-wing media, there will be no, what we define as truth decay. We will not be in this cognitive crisis in trying to clarify reality, understanding reality. This is all the problem is there.
In the United States, I'm talking very specifically from detailed empirical investigation of disinformation, misinformation, and confusion in the United States.
This is important, Yochai, this is important. It's not, at least from my perspective, it's not only a US problem. It's a global problem. It's a problem that characterized Western liberal democracies. So how do you see the problem outside the United States?
So let me just, I know I was very aggressive because I was frustrated with listening to all of this. Let me try to anchor this a little bit more.
No, this is why we brought you here. We still believe in the free market of ideas. We like doubt and...
Itai, you know it sounds better in Hebrew, this tone. We need country-specific studies to understand what happened. I think it's entirely possible, for example, that in India, it's WhatsApp. That's the initial set of studies that suggest that that's true. The problem with those studies is that they don't have the infrastructure to review Republic TV, which is the Fox News equivalent in India. Nobody has the foggiest idea what's happening on vernacular TV in the various regions. And so, of course, if we look in this narrow corner, that's what we think. Colleagues of ours who have looked at two countries using our techniques, and our techniques in this regard, both in terms of the amount of data and the cross platform analysis are quite distinctive. In Germany and France, don't find the same degree of confusion. In Germany in particular, there's relatively high trust in public TV. Most of the people have a sense of what's anchored in public TV as the truth, and there's a narrower slice only in the AfD, only in the far right, who does create its alternative existence. In France, the structure is again different. The answer is we need to study each country on its own. We need to get user side data to understand who's consuming, what they're consuming, how it's affecting them. There is a broad international problem, but that international problem, I think, is not driven by social media, but rather by the collapse of neoliberalism in the Great Recession and the emergence of various radical rejectionist parties, mostly on the right, sometimes on the left, like Syriza in Greece. And it's those parties that are moving aside that are driving this deep distrust in a mainstream. And on top of that, you have media architectures. But that's the claim.
Thank you, Professor Benkler. Dr. Tehila Schwarz-Altschuler is a senior fellow at the Israel Democracy Institute and head of the Institute's Media Reform Program and also the Democracy in the Information Age program. Hi, Tehila. So, Tehila, probably you have a lot to say about this debate, but more specifically, what does the US election teach us about the threats to democracy?
Well, there's so much to say. Maybe I'll start by referring to the first two presentations. There's an interconnection between social media and traditional media. So I don't think we can actually separate the discussion of television and social media. I do agree with Professor Benkler that it is different between different countries, but I think that the interconnection or the influence that social media had during the past decade or so on traditional media is not neglectable. So of what we've seen with social media during the past week, I think around the elections at the United States is certainly a milestone. It is very different than what we've seen in 2016. In a way, we can say that maybe 2016, the social media was just a platform. They sold services to whoever was willing to pay. They have exercised their algorithm in the same way they did, in a regular time. At 2020, they became an active player, which is, after all, a milestone. So first of all, we can see social media platforms as the responsible adult. But on the other hand, you can say that was kind of a censorship. They did not erase or remove content, but what we've seen is that they have altered search results, they labeled posts, they downranked problematic content. They implemented a host of measures to ward off what they thought was misinformation. Facebook has pinned the election results to the top of the users' news feeds. It is still appending labels to Trump's post explaining the truth behind the election. Twitter is no longer fully restricting Trump's tweets, but it still continues to add labels warning users that this claim about elections fraud is disputed. Even YouTube is taking action now. It's demonetizing videos from outlets such as the Trump-affiliated One American News Network that claims that Trump won, and yet it certainly can be considered as censorship on the heart of political speech. It's tweets and posts by a president who is a candidate on election week, let's say. So it is a milestone. I think secondly, and here I want to refer to what Professor Benkler just said, I think that what the networks have been doing, kind of backed traditional media, because there is an interconnection between TV and social media. And US networks, ABC, CBS, NBC, they all took the very unusual step of cutting away from the president, made unfounded the accusation that the presidential elections was being stolen. And in this context of fact-checking and fake news spreading, I think that was one of the most important moments of the entire presidential race, maybe even the last 4 years. And we'll have to think about the consequences of all this. But the question I think I was asked was why all this has happened. And I think that the first reason would be, as you have mentioned, Itai, before, it's COVID. And maybe this is, the biggest difference between Trump and Biden, because Biden represents a presidential invocation of science, wear masks. And Trump represents a presidential invocation maybe of bleach. I think that the networks understood that there is a matter of life and death here. But also the other, I would say, reason for that is the threat of regulation, because social media companies may not have a choice if the government steps in and forces them to make changes. They are under increased scrutiny from the government, not only the American government, it's also coming from Europe, to squash misinformation and disclose how the information they see might differ from what others see. So I think that the main question after the elections is not whether to regulate social media, but how to do that. I think that the ship has taken the turn already. I don't know if you want me to refer now to what I think we need to look ahead, or I've been talking enough. Let me just...
No. Maybe short answer. Can you put it in the Israeli context, following what this debate with Yochanan Benkler, but what happened in the United States? Can you put it in the Israeli context?
Well, I want to say something. I hope I'm not going to sound weird. While the social media platforms signed, for example, tweets as premature, and American networks stopped Trump's speeches in the middle, everything that Trump said, without any kind of, I would say, asking hard questions, was published in Israeli media. So I don't know if we're getting into an election year here in Israel, but if social media companies are going to start acting the same way they did in the United States, I doubt it, whether the Israeli traditional media is going to be responsible enough as the American media was. And this is something for me, which is, I would say, a source of concern.
Thank you very much, Tehila. We'll go to Bill Marceliano. Bill is a senior behavioral scientist at RAND Corporation and a professor at the RAND Graduate School. Bill, you are the lead author of Foreign Interference in the 2020 Election, Tools for Detecting Online Election Interference. So first, you are probably referring to threats that are coming from the outside, foreign interference. Did you identify foreign interference in the 2020 election? And if so, what was the interference? Who are the actors? What are their goals?
So we definitely found at least one large-scale election interference effort over social media, and it was aimed at the US 2020 general election. And we found that it matched known Russian tactics. It also matches their overarching theory of reflexive control in this kind of area. It matched their ends. And in particular, the machine learning algorithms we use were trained on prior Russian linguistic samples from Russian trolls. So I don't have a smoking gun, but we're pretty confident it was indeed a Russian controlled and Russian authored effort. And the question about their ends is really important. We found that they had two primary goals. The first of them was to spread hyper-partisan themes and content using both troll and what appear to be botnet accounts working in concert. So the first one really is sowing distrust and dissension by amplifying existing partisan tensions in the U.S. polity. So I'll harken back to what Nina was saying. It's not like they're introducing sort of new, fractures. It's, Americans have these really, really serious concerns about each other and really serious mistrusts around ideology and political identity. And so the first effort was really about boosting those tensions and sort of convincing people that, hey, our side is in a death struggle with either Nazis or socialists, and they can't be trusted. The second part of it seems to have been a preference for Donald Trump over Joe Biden. So we found troll accounts were spreading pro-Trump content within a very large community of pro-Trump supporters who are also sharing a lot of like deep state, conspiracy theories, QAnon content. And then we found within the Biden support community, there were left-wing trolls, but they were actually spreading undermining content about Joe Biden. He wasn't a real progressive. He wasn't actually going to win. Sanders was a better choice. And then finally, we found pro-Sanders content as well. So the three of those we think add up. We infer showed a preference for Donald Trump as a candidate.
And can you measure the impact? Maybe it's too early for 2020, but looking back at 2016 or other elections around the world, is it working? Does it really influence people, convince them to change their vote, increasing their confidence in their candidate? How can you measure the impact of this foreign interference?
So that's a really good question. And you asked sort of two sort of stages or two sort of levels of testing. One is, how do we go from the campaign effort to how it impacts the ultimate goal, like changing votes or sort of changing outside real world behaviors? That's a hard question. And that's a really open question, whether or not these are really effective that way. The intermediate step, which is how do they impact the audience and how do they affect their perception of their candidates or their position? So we, as part of the same large scale study, we also did an empirical investigation. We did a experimental treatment. We exposed people, including self-identified very liberal and very conservative US voters. And we showed them a range of content that had been out there, including Russian propaganda memes. And we found two really interesting things. One of them is it worked really, really well. If you were really left-wing or really right-wing, you loved the content. You had a strong positive impact. You're like, this is great stuff. And those people said, I'd love to share this. I want to share this with people on social media. The interesting and maybe encouraging thing is that when we showed people the source and they realized it was propaganda, their pleasure in it and their affect went way down and their willingness to share it decreased. So that suggests, one, at least in the sense of impacting people's ideology and beliefs, it's effective. But then secondly, maybe there's an intervention there, is that revealing the source seems to have a powerful impact on people's willingness to be manipulated. People don't want to feel like I'm being worked. And then maybe a second question is this overall, how do we measure effectiveness? And again, there's this whole research area about, advertising and marketing kind of stuff. Trying to scale this up to social media and really measure the impact of campaigns can be challenging. We have used a thing called resonance analysis. It's possible to get a large corpus of data around a propaganda campaign to build a linguistic quantitative model of the specific words and distributions of that campaign, and then look across social media populations over time and say by location, like panel studies, and see, are people adopting the language? We can measure the adoption or the rejection of that language model. Again, it doesn't get us to like, hey, how will you vote? Will you join an organization? Will you act violently? That's an additional step. But we can certainly measure whether or not people are buying the market share because your ideology is bundled into your language. Like anyone who's been a member of an organization that believes in it very passionately, now you can't use some language. So like in the US, for example, if you are very passionate about the legality of abortion, if you're on one side, you have to use words like unborn children and babies because it's implicated in your worldview and your membership. And on the other side, you have to use words like fetuses and women's rights and women's bodies. Again, it's bundled into your advocacy position and your the population you're a member of. So the ability to measure that and to see, are people buying into and adopting your language? That is possible. We be able to use that at scale on social media.
Thank you very much. Alicia Wanless is the director of the Partnership for Countering Influence Operations at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. Alicia, do you see what we are talking about as a new phenomenon, or it's something we've seen in the past in maybe a different structure, a different color?
First, thank you for having me. It's always nice to join a lively conversation. And as for the question, is the problem with disinformation new? The short answer is no. Is there more disinformation today? Probably, but that's also there's also a lot more information in general. That's something we face every time we introduce a new means for processing information, be it printing, television, or web-based technologies. And also, it's difficult to get a baseline of what came before, what was normal. It's really hard to say for certain if there's a rise and to what degree, but that doesn't mean it isn't a problem. So what I would call information pollution isn't new. There have always been people degrading the information environment for their own aims, be it to seek power, proselytize a belief, or turn a profit. Even Thucydides bemoaned that Athenians were believing falsehoods about Spartan governance models. And if you look to a past election in the US, some Southern newspaper editors in the lead up to the 1860 US presidential election spread falsehoods that Lincoln's running mate Hamlin was a mulatto. And there were other horror stories too about what would happen if the Black Republicans won office. So what has changed in a digital age is that information communications technologies have increased the speed of communications and the reach to audiences. The second thing is that these mass communications are now multi-directional, meaning anyone can engage. So it can also help obfuscate their origins, wrapping audiences up more into a form of participatory propaganda. And thirdly, these technologies have really increased the amount of data aggregated on individuals. At the same time, scholarship in psychology grows to help target audiences. But I'd also like to state that disinformation, however, is but one tactic in influence operations more broadly, and an overemphasis on a singular tactic and case studies about them in developing our understanding of the broader phenomenon, it leaves us strategically disadvantaged. So to borrow a military metaphor, we're trying to win a war with tactics alone. And what's desperately needed right now is a way to understand the information environment in general and the disturbances within it, much the same way that we do currently with weather or the physical environment. That would help give us a better range of options to develop proper strategy.
And can you elaborate on this last issue? What is the broader picture? How can we go from tactics to strategy?
Yeah, absolutely. So one way in to look at this is that what we're doing is we're operating in a wider information environment. And if this were something like a war, we would be thinking about the terrain in which we're operating, thinking about how the weather patterns might change, and that would give us an advantage. But currently, we don't really think about the information environment in that way. Our entire understanding seems to be quite wrapped up in actors trying to make a change, rather than, what is the space in which we're working in? And in terms of countering these things, there really aren't many easy answers. At the partnership, we've been conducting meta studies on things like social media platform interventions. And while those interventions have rose considerably in the wake of COVID-19, there's still little publicly available information on what works and what doesn't. And that's one of the reasons why we're standing up some work streams around measurements. But even with those studies not completed, there are some obvious things that would help towards countering influence operations, including having the political will to do something, which is generally very difficult because many politicians benefit from influence operations. But that high level determination can change things like education, both for youth and adults, for preparing them to live in an information age. But we also need things like better cross-sector collaboration to inform industry on how to counter influence operations while not undermining democracy. Researchers also need to start speaking the same language. I mean, we've thrown around many different terms to talk about things that are very similar, and that's extremely problematic, especially for developing policy. Finally, we need to accept that this problem is very old and very human. It's always going to be there, and society might never be rid of it, but we need means to better mitigate unacceptable influence operations, whatever those are deemed to be. So there's likely no easy answer, not even in technology.
Thank you very much, and we'll probably go back to that. Mr. Agnes Bridgman is a research fellow at the Center for the Study of Democratic Citizenship. Maybe we can now shift from US election, general issues, to more specifically COVID-19. What can you tell us about who was behind COVID-19 disinformation?
So I could switch. I don't want to though. I want to engage with all this other great conversation, but maybe we can save that for the Q&A. The one thing I did want to say is, like, I think totally Yochai's point about looking at country-specific effects is very important. So I'm Canadian and I study primarily Canada, and it's obviously a completely different ecosystem and completely different information environment from the United States and international communities, but it's very much in the orbit of sort of the English language social media environment. And because of that, I think that there is a lot more, maybe you just undersold it, Yochai, but there's a lot of spillover effects from country to country. I think the infodemic, the pandemic nature of things moving from country to country is very important when we're talking about dis and misinformation. So the question is about sort of who's behind COVID-19 disinformation, and I study online kind of political activism, digital activism, and I think that yes, there's probably some influence operations. There's been so much discussion of China and Russia in the media, and okay, yes, probably there's some of that. That's largely based on anecdote and innuendo, but for sure, the bulk of what we would sort of say like is misleading content or is content that might be contributing to some of these misperceptions is homegrown, is people who are, who care deeply about politics and believe very strongly that they have done their research and that they have the answers and that they can help inform their fellow citizenry. So, in Canada, we have a very high trust population, generally a very high respect for traditional media organizations. But that doesn't mean that there's not a massive number of Canadians who are actively engaged online in trying to sort of make political points, but what we would sort of identify as mis and disinformation. So I think that's
the purpose for that is what is their goal? What is their objective? Why are they doing that?
So I think that the most useful frame to think about this is political participation. These are people who genuinely believe in the information that they're propagating. In a similar way to people might protest or people might write their representative. They are politically participating. They care deeply, and this is sort of what I look at. And I've done large-scale surveys, looked at massive amounts of social media data. And, when you talk to social media users who are incredibly active, and I mean like the super users, the people who really care deeply about politics, you ask them, hey, how do you engage politically? And they go, oh, Twitter. That's how I do it. I do it on Facebook. Yeah, I share, I talk to my family, I try to get my ideas out there. What's the purpose of that? Well, they're participating in a free and deliberative democratic society. I mean, if you go to the protests, Canada hasn't had them as large as the United States, but you've seen major protests in Montreal, Toronto, Vancouver. And if you go to these protests and you talk to people, maybe there's some misperceptions about COVID-19, but they're there because they're patriots and they care and they think that what they're doing is for the good of the country. They're there for freedom. And I don't mean sort of freedom in patriotism and I think the somewhat condescending way it's talked about in the United States amongst sort of the intellectual community, where like patriot is now a buzzword for like, okay, we know what you're about now that you've said the word patriot. I mean people who really believe that they care about their country and are trying to save it from like dictatorship or oppression. So I think that when we say who's behind this stuff, disinformation, in the Canadian context, from sort of the research that we've done, has played a relatively small role, but misinformation and the spread of these ideas is everywhere on social media. So I think sort of the piece that sort of caused the invite to this panel was something published in the Misinformation Review, which was a piece kind of trying to link how and when people consume media to misperceptions they have about COVID-19 and specific real world behaviors that they engage in. And it's very hard to do that link. And there's ways to get at it. But I could talk for hours about sort of the problems of connecting these things and particularly disparate social media platforms. But basically, and this is no surprise, people who consume more social media and use social media as their primary source of news have many more misperceptions around COVID-19 and are much, much less likely to engage in sort of recommended social distancing behaviors. I think that's not a surprise, but I think it's useful to sort of really lay that out clearly. That social media is the main way these things are propagated. And we're working on a piece right now that I'm pretty excited about, which is to sort of say, okay, how does this information cross international borders? It's very easy to think about this globalized information ecosystem, but actually, there's preferences. So for example, Reddit is much larger in Canada and per capita than any other country. So like Reddit is Canadians are overrepresented on Reddit massively. So it plays a huge role in our information ecosystem. Parler has become increasingly popular, and these platforms are driving a lot of this stuff. And I think this is new, and I think this is global, and this is a real challenge. And I mean, I have lots of ideas and things, but maybe I'll leave it there with the 5 minutes unless there's another follow-up question.
Thank you very much. And we'll pass to Ohad Zeidenberg. Ohad is the lead founder of the CTI League, the first nonprofit community that aspires to protect the medical sector against cyber attacks and disinformation. So, Ohad, what can you tell us about the forces, the actors behind COVID-19 misinformation or disinformation?
So, hello everyone, and I'm really happy to be part of this amazing conference. Regarding your question, Itai, the threat actors that trying to spreading fake news, disinformation, misinformation worldwide, it's really hard to determine the specific threat actors because it's almost everyone. It can be state-sponsored attack that trying to leveraging the crisis to make some profit or promoting their interests worldwide. And we see this in the 3 big countries that spreading fake news worldwide, that it's Iran, Russia, and China. But also, we see a lot of people that really have truly belief in the disinformation that they're spreading. And I want to cover some of the COVID-19 themes that we identified in the CTI League regarding the pandemic. One of them is COVID isn't a serious problem. COVID doesn't exist, or individual medical targets the medical facilities worldwide and trying to reduce their power. Maybe it's a medical scam or some myths about the origin of the pandemic. Some people that says it's escaped bioweapons or country X created COVID to make or to promote their interests worldwide. It can be crossovers with other conspiracies, and this is really dangerous because when the COVID is involved with the 5G or anti-vax or anti-gates, if I will be more specific, it's really tricky. So people can promote fake news or disinformation about the corona crisis because they have any political interests, but they can also spread the fake news because they really believe in. And to find the origin of the fake news, to find the people that is behind it is really hard because it can be one person, as I said, that really believe that, for example, COVID and 5G has a connection and want to do something about it. But it can be other people, it can be a political entity that trying to make some influence on people worldwide and maybe try to convince something about the US to promote other interests in the world.
Thank you. And maybe as a short answer, can you tell us what actions did you take to counter the spreading of COVID-19 disinformation, the actual measures that were taken by you, by the CTI League?
So really early in the pandemic, we created the CTI League mainly to protect hospitals, but also the medical sector and the life-saving organization worldwide from cyber attacks. And for my region, in the company that I work for as an employee, I covered multiple times disinformation operations executed mainly by Iran. And from there, I have truly believing in analyzing disinformation with tools of threat hunting and threat intelligence on the matter of cyber attacks. So we really consider the disinformation as part of this map. We created a strong disinformation team with some of the goals that I want to share with you. And the main mission of that is to help to prevent harm directly related to the COVID-19 disinformation, is to support them. In order to support the mission, we gather information about fake news incidents, narratives worldwide, and we try to escalate them to law enforcement organizations, take down notice to the platform that have the power to reduce the level of threat. For example, for social platforms, social media platform, or some other companies that can literally take down malicious media outlet or fake media outlet that are executed by websites. We can alert it to the organization that people spread fake news about them, to get help from media influencer. And we have some tactics to fight the fake news. And in each different incident, we identify what is the best way to answer these fake news incidents. It can be detect, deny, disrupt, degrade the fake news, to slow them down, to deceive, to divert them, to destroy them, and to deter them. It means that we do discourage for the threat actors if we identify them, in order to reduce the amount of fake news in the social media, for example.
And Ohad, from an analyst perspective, when you see this disinformation effort in the form of cyber attacks, from your perspective, what is the reason? What is the goal? What they are aimed to achieve?
It can be one of, in my opinion, 6 main digital harms that they can make. They can make physical harm, like literally physical harm, to spread the fake news in order to make people act physical in the real world against people. It can be psychological harm. It can be economic harm. For example, to make a financial loss for an organization, or from a data breach, cybercrime, to promote cybercrime. It can be harm to the reputation of the organizations that under attack of fake news. It can make a cultural harm, or as we started with, political harm. It means that, for example, we have disruption the political processes in worldwide. It can be various or few goals for the people that spreading fake news. Some of the incidents that we analyzed, for example, were people that tried to promote and executed some unmasked march worldwide. They really asked people to get out from the home without mask and go together as one unit. And it can be a disaster for the world, because this can literally create a second, a third, or another wave of infection. It's really, really dangerous, and we really keep the eye on it.
Thanks, Ohad. And our last panelist is Dr. Ofer Friedman, lecturer and director of operations at King Center for Strategic Communications. Ofer, we talked about political disinformation. We talked about COVID-19 disinformation, misinformation. Do you see difference between, for example, COVID-19 disinformation and the political disinformation? Ofer, you are muted. Get out of mute.
Yes, hello, sorry. Thank you very much for having me here, inviting me. To answer your question, I would say maybe there are some characteristics of information of the content itself, which is different, but on conceptual level, there is not much difference. And continuing what has been said so far by several speakers here, I would like to take some hype out of disinformation. We've been talking too much of disinformation. There is general over-focus on disinformation in general. Disinformation as a political phenomenon has been with us for years. It's a natural part of political behavior. There is very little new on how it used, although indeed with the development of new information communication technologies, it can be spread faster, it can be produced faster on larger scale. but we actually don't know whether it influences better than printed propaganda of the 19th century. So we need to kind of take it into perspective and understand the general context and understand that disinformation is an inherent part of our personal life and political life. On personal level, we all spread disinformation on daily basis. Like I would like every one of us to think about our profile picture on our websites or Facebook accounts. To what extent this is actual true representation of our face in the morning when we wake up. So on personal level, we all spread this information, which is harmless and it's okay. It's a part of daily life. On political level, it can be more harmful. But again, it's a natural part of social existence. So this is the first point that I wanted to make. The second point is kind of the topic of today's panel is 2020. So you ask us to refer what we have learned, what has happened. So continuing again what Professor Benkler said, and also Alicia and some others, we need to understand that this prism of disinformation of foreign agents that are trying to influence, it's a very limited one. It allows us to see very limited picture of overall political influence conducted by information manipulations. We have been over-focused on this disinformation discourse for two main reasons. The first one is something tangible. We can see it. To see and realize other more complex information manipulations is much more difficult. It's less tangible. Disinformation, on the other hand, which is based on lies, all this disinformation and fake news, it's very tangible and visible. It's relatively easy to trace down, but we also have to remember, and this is the second point, that propaganda based on lies is very bad propaganda. And our opponents, whether those who spread this information, whether those who try to influence politically and manipulate information, they are much smarter and much more nuanced, whether they come in from abroad or they domestic. So what I would say, what we have learned in 2020 is, I think we reached a certain point when we understand this information, we can tackle this information. It's about the time that we move forward to understanding better how political influence via information manipulations works in the 21st century. We need to get rid of this very limited prism of disinformation and try what Alicia was referring to understand how different actors, whether they're domestic and or foreign, and whether this distinction even relevant, trying to create political influence through information operations and information manipulations. So I think we're already there. We already understand it. We know to trace it because it's easy traceable. We know to debunk it with all these networks and NGOs and institutions established to debunk fake news and so on. So we already reached this point. We understand it. We can deal with it. We can point it out. We can also, as one of the speakers said, well, we can actually discover the source to the audience. So I think it's a time where we step forward to a more deep waters of information influence and try to understand how that works.
Thank you very much, Ofer, and that's complete the first round of our discussion. There are some participants that want to comment, and I'll give them the mic in a minute, but there is one general question that I want to put on the table, because not all of us, and I will turn to Yochai in a minute, but most of us believe that threats are coming from the outside and from the inside, and in some way they are coordinated. I'm not talking about collusion or some kind of an organized coordination, but they are echoing each other in some ways they are coordinated. So I wonder if the panelists can comment or talk about the ways this coordination is being done, how the outside and the inside, the foreign and the domestic are working together in the same domain. So we'll start with Yochai and then Tehila.
Great, thanks. I think it's important, and I'll try to answer your question partly by moderating a little bit what I said and emphasizing several things that others have said in the panel. I think it's really important to understand the differences between individual level confusion and population level effects, between successful manipulation of groups of hyperactivated people, like Ohad was talking about, if you can get people out without masks to walk around. And we certainly do need to think, as Tehila said, about the interaction between social media and mainstream media. And my primary point is that in large scale election level things that carry huge attention, and when we're talking about population level effects that can shift millions of votes, mass media leads and social media is secondary. There's no question that on the specific issues of does garlic infused water help or something else help? That's you can see much more of social media being purely about that and not about the mass media. Then there are things like hydroxychloroquine, which start to some extent online, but then take off through Fox News to Trump, and then it becomes politically complete. So what we looked at when we looked at all of the assertions about Russian intervention in 2016, which was much more present than in 2020, the interaction that we found, the coordination essentially that we found in the larger effects. So for example, when there were allegations that fake Twitter handles or Facebook groups that were Russian, that came in the Mueller indictment or came in the congressional reports, what we saw essentially was Russian accounts jumping on the bandwagon. Trump had started something, Republican and right-wing media jumped on, and then 72 hours later, you get the interventions that are the subject of the, and that was fairly consistent. We also found one clear example of a Podesta email that was driven on 4chan and then identified by a Sputnik reporter who moonlighted on a blog that then went into InfoWars and Hannity and became all across the right-wing media. So there are examples of those kinds of insertions. It's very difficult to associate them as having had population level impact on the background of sustained disinformation campaign. So if Fox News produces the Clinton pedophilia connection as their most Facebook shared story that's sustained over months and is most linked to by everybody as a source of authority, the fact that there's also a Sputnik reporter moonlighting on a third-tier blog that succeeds in getting a particular insertion of it being part of a satanic ritual as well is less exciting. That's what I mean. So there is this interaction. If you're focused on narrow groups, we can actually trace very specifically where the effects were both on media and on people. And but if you're talking population level effects, at least our research suggests that you need to see mass media first and other things after.
Yes. And maybe just to follow what you said previously, if this is the problem, the way you characterize the problem, so what is the solution? Isn't it part of the free market of idea? Isn't it part of the political debate? How can we get out of it?
So maybe this is the explanation for my very forceful intervention when I started, because I think the critical thing is actually not what people in the disinformation business do and how they can be countered. There is no empirical evidence that media literacy has any lasting effects beyond 2 or 3 weeks. Most of the people who consume actively, there's this lovely paper from PNAS from a couple of years ago looking at Russian trolls and interactions with them, and practically everybody is people who already wanted to hear what they were hearing from the trolls, and so they were looking for it. You can say fact check from now till doomsday. That will only prove that you're in cahoots with the bad guys. so that's not going to work. What matters is how mainstream media covers it. Remembering that we overstate the centrality of social media. Take the survey evidence we have about the US itself. 18% of Americans say that social media, all social media, is their primary source of political news. 16% have network news, 13% have local news, TV, network news, CNN. What we need to be able, there's a chunk of the population that is lost because it's inside and only wants confirmation. But the critical thing is for the mainstream, where most people who just don't want to think about politics every day, they just see some politics in their peripheral vision. That's where they get their anchors about what is and isn't reliable. And it's critically important that the mainstream talk about what is the real threat and what isn't, not focus on technology, not focused on social networks. And we saw it actually in the US in the last 2 or 3 months. I think we've seen mainstream media be much more aggressive in being willing to, on the spot, block things, call them false, use truth sandwich. That's not going to affect the people inside the right-wing media ecosystem, but it helps it from diffusing to broader parts of the population that are not as intensively interested in it. And that's the primary vector of action.
Thank you very much, Professor Benkler. Dr. Tehila Schwarz-Altschuler.
Okay, so I want to talk a little bit about to stick to the elections and what we can learn from it, and try to elaborate on that and see what we can learn. I think that even though we've seen some possible glimpse of light at the end of the, let's say, post-truth tunnel, the end of the election campaign, the end of the presumptive end of Trump's presidency will not bring with it a misinformation ceasefire. And this is, I think, because the hyperpartisanship and the tense societal factors and the divergent news diet by traditional television, as Professor Benkler said, or at least the divergent, let's say, interpretations of the news, they're all fed back through social media. So this interconnection can't actually be divided. You've asked before about the virtual collusion between foreign actors and internal actors. We need to understand that the information that we get from social media works in a two-level fake, I would say. The first level of the fake is the algorithm of the social media networks themselves. We don't know exactly how the social media algorithm work. That same algorithm that select the what information we see, because the technology, as we all know, is a black box controlled by the respective social media company that build it. And the second level is the manipulation that all different actors are doing on this algorithm. Those are the avatars and the trolls and the fakes and all those things. So we do need to understand that the foreign and local entities are using this double fake system. And as to the question, what we need to do, I do agree with what Ofer has said before. Bad information will always be a part of an open society. But as the actions of journalists, fact checkers, and the social media companies have shown, I think during the past, let's say 10 days, there are plenty of new tactics that can be used in order to, that we can use in order to fight it. But I want to emphasize that the platforms at this point are huge. They're mature. More than huge, and they have all sorts of resources, all sorts of abilities to figure out ahead of time and certainly monitor afterwards what kind of impact all their algorithmic tweaks are having on users' information and consumption. And this is, I think, an important point. Having said all of that, I think that the main responsibility is on governments, is on local governments, not on social media. 80 years ago, it was television. When governments realized that here comes a new medium, which becomes very influential, they started to regulate it. It's not that we were so good in regulating television. Otherwise, Professor Benkler wouldn't have said whatever he has said before. But we can certainly learn from, or the lessons from traditional media policy and try to see what we need to do now. So if I can just, in a couple of quick points. First of all, we need to rethink traditional media policy. There's this very interesting paper by the Stigler School of Business from the University of Chicago, which was published about a year ago. We at the Israel Democracy Institute have just published a paper about the future of Israeli journalism. So we talk about antitrust, we talk about new business models, we talk about strengthening journalistic professionalism and ethics. I think we need to be very, very careful not to go to the easy place where we're going to allow social media companies give hash money to traditional media. We also can learn a lot of things about the platforms themselves. For example, we need a unification of the community standards. What we've seen during the past days was very different policies. For example, by being exercised by Twitter and by YouTube. And as long as you don't have unified community standard, it's going to be very misleading to the public. You need also a much more intensive work in order to clean social media platforms from fake news and conspiracy theories. I mean, we've seen a lot of stuff being done, but it seems to me that even the platforms continue to implement special measures aimed at reducing the spread of misinformation. It seems a little bit that they're running out of steam already. They don't need to search under the street lamp, I would say, on Donald Trump's personal account. They need to look for the closed Facebook groups where the conspiracy theories actually start before they start spreading. And more than everything, as I said before, there is a huge need of cooperation between governments and social media companies. As much as I'm happy that social media platforms have acted like responsible adults, I think the main responsibility should be put on the shoulders of governments. The discussion as to the limits of freedom of speech should be a local discussion and not an international discussion. I think that would be enough for now.
Thank you very much, Tehila. Angus?
This is a really interesting discussion. Thanks for turning to me. I think one of the threads here that we've been talking about is sort of whether or not social media is important or not, and like how much importance we should place on it in our public discourse, how much we should care about it when we're trying to talk about mis and disinformation. Of course, mis and disinformation is not new, but the social media is somewhat new, and we're reaching 10, 15 years of influence now. But I think one of the things that I would like to highlight, and there's a lot of really good research about the agenda setting capability of social media. And I know Yochai, you've done some really great work tracing specific instances, but what stories are covered, what pieces are important to sort of traditional media elites, there is some link. And so should we put all of our eggs in that basket? Should we just sort of try to regulate social media companies and try to really focus on that as a way to combating this? Well, no, that's not all that we can do. But actually, that's such a huge piece because, I mean, at least in the Canadian context, every journalist, every sort of major news organization is glued to Twitter. I mean, there's numerous studies of this, and they use it to inform what they care about and what's being reported on. The story's explosion, yeah, it's often linked to sort of traditional media anchors, but that continuing conversation occurs on social media and can continue to push it and attention of people. So I think that remains very important. The other thing, I think it's very difficult to get population level insight from social media analysis, and like early Twitter, like early academic publishing in the Twitter, looking at Twitter was really interesting, trying to predict elections and really trying to understand can we use this to do some amazing things? And no, it turns out we can't really do any of that. But I think part of that is that we're a bit kind of walking in the dark here as researchers. And this is I guess a slightly trite point for somebody who doesn't actively research this, but in my perspective, this is like trying to manage a pandemic. This is like my little homegrown analogy is like, if you think about trying to manage a pandemic and you're looking at hospital admissions and you get like top level aggregates from hospitals around the country, but you have no idea about like individual treatments that any patient has received. And then you're trying to make some sort of or how they've lived their lives or who they've contacted. And you have such this narrow slice of data. And it's actually worse because you have that hospital, but then there's like an alternative medical system, which is, let's say, Twitter, and then there's Facebook, and then there's Parler. You can't really access that. And then there's Reddit. And we are hopelessly outgunned. I don't know if anyone sort of on the call is subscribed to like a Facebook job postings, but like the number of behavioral scientists that they've been hiring in recent years, and not just Facebook, social media companies trying to better understand this. If you want the good data, if you want to really understand what's going on, you have to be internal to these companies. And that to me is very scary as a researcher. If you are dependent upon the institution you're supposed to be researching on for funding, for resources, and for data access. And there is absolutely no easy solution that I see there. The Canadian government really, during our last election in 2019, put a huge amount of emphasis in trying to get the social media companies to give better data, and they were somewhat successful. And we had a relatively clean election. But like the Facebook ad library is such a great example. If anyone's used the Facebook ad library, and you can see they spent between $1 and $25,000. What am I supposed to do with that as a researcher? How can you possibly use that to inform the public discourse? So that's like, I just will stand on a hill and yell that loudly until, I die.
Thank you very much. And Bill Marceliano.
Thank you. And I wanted to talk back to the original question about sort of coordination of external and internal sort of efforts and how they sync up. But before I do, real quick, Angus, I really echo your concern too about transparency, access to data between platforms and the outside research committee. And it's really irritating to me and confusing because it's so arbitrary. Like Twitter talks to us sometimes. I don't know why. Facebook's like a black hole of refuseniks. We've actually had really good dialogue with Google and with particular Google's Jigsaw unit, who have been actively engaged, invited us in. I have no idea why those three platforms are so wildly different in their willingness to collaborate and talk. And that is also a major frustration as well. So I just wanted to double down on that. I'll be on that hill with you yelling as well. But onto this idea of how external and internal efforts sort of sync up. Just as an example, in our study, we looked at a lot of, we had an algorithm identifying sort of troll likelihood. So we looked at a lot of the examples of the ones our algorithm said, hey, these look like trolls. They really look highly rated as trolls. And one of the things I noticed was a sort of parallelism of their messaging efforts and how they really depended on sort of homegrown, beliefs, attitudes, and sort of appealing messages. So one of the less savory, really to me like a low-end tactic, was the circulation by these accounts and the reception of doctored photographs of both former First Lady Michelle Obama and Ivanka Trump and Melania Trump. So if you had these left-wing posing trolls circulating the Trump women pictures that had been doctored and often in very sexualized, misogynistic ways. And those had enthusiastic uptake and were retweeted and recirculated and well received by progressive communities they were aimed at. And then on the flip side, you had these incredibly racist comments and racist and then like masculinizing, however to say that, of Michelle Obama, as if she was a man, actually, from these conservative posing trolls in these communities. And they weren't introducing this idea. It wasn't like Americans didn't have, on both sides, a willingness to sort of express their ideological position by hating, first ladies on the other side and demonizing them. And so I saw a real confluence and saw many examples of that, where clearly these external efforts were piggybacking off of what people wanted to hear, the existing themes and ideas. A good example would be a lot of non-political content from highly ranked right-wing troll accounts was just videos of Black Americans behaving poorly or violently. And there was no direct political message, but along with and inside the stream of anti-Black Lives Matter material, it was clearly meant to be racist and to say Black people are can't be trusted. They're like animals. Here they are fighting. This really, really racist idea, and that's a homegrown reception from that audience. Thank you.
Alicia?
Thanks. Just coming back to the research collaboration with industry, it is a huge problem. And one place to look might be in adapting collaborative research models between defense and academia. Things like the US federally funded research and development centers might be an example that could be adapted to work. I'd also return to what Offer had said earlier too. We need other ways to look at this problem beyond singular tactics and what actors do. And one option is to develop an information ecology. Ecology is essentially the study of the environment, and we need the equivalent holistic approach to the information environment. For example, physical ecosystems tend to experience disturbances, and the same can be found in an information ecosystem. New ideas erupt and they spread, disrupting neighboring communities. Old sticky ideas take root. They can be really hard to change, and they often dig in after a new idea has emerged. There are things like information floods. They occur every time we have a new way to process information, and in tandem tends to follow information pollution, right? So floods of low quality information on a specific idea. And sometimes these do follow different types of events. There are definitely patterns that emerge. So for example, we know that when a crisis happens, people seek information because uncertainty makes it psychologically upsetting for them. If this is happening again and again, we know what type of event will eventually happen. Why aren't we planning better to be prepared for something like a pandemic? The only thing we don't know is when a crisis will emerge, but we can work out how to respond. So for example, relying on public health officials to be heard through the noisy modern information environment isn't enough. The response needs to be coordinated. And we can ensure reliable information is positioned in front of people. Social media platforms did try to help, but that ought to have already been in place before an actual pandemic hit. So we do have the capacity to plan as humans. I think we just tend not to. Thanks.
Thank you very much for all the participants. It's been a very interesting discussion. Maybe two things to take out from this discussion. One, I think we do have a problem of measuring the impact, problem of measurement. Does it really influence the people? Is it a real problem? Whether, anyway, we define the problem, is it a real problem that have impact on our political culture, political behavior, political discourse? So this one issue of measurement sounds to be very problematic. And the second, though they were offers for possible solutions, I think that most of us are quite pessimistic. Western liberal democracies were built on this free market of idea, on doubt and debate, and this mechanism seems to work. It doesn't work. It seems that it doesn't work in the digital era, and I don't think that we currently have ideas on how to cope with the problem. Though, of course, there are the regulation channels, the education channels, the technological channels, but putting all things together, it's quite pessimistic. So thank you very much, and hope to see you again. We are now shutting down, and exactly on 1800 our time, in about 38 minutes, we'll have the second panel that will be broadcast from King's College and will deal with strategic communication and memory construction. Thank you very much, and good evening from Tel Aviv.